We are still in Chapter 11, Feudalism and the Middle Ages, and we are doing Section 2, and specifically we are in Lesson 5, War and Plague, that is pages 314 to 315. Go ahead, log into our Loda.usd website, and from there Clever, and from Clever log into Cengage Learning, which is our world history book, using your student account with your password, and go to Unit 5, and from Unit 5 to Chapter 11, and from Chapter 11 Section 2, Section 2 Lesson 5. The title of the lesson is War and Plague, pages 314 to 315. The objective of this lesson is to discuss how war and disease killed so many Europeans in the 1300s and fundamentally changed society. And the essential question is, how did Europe change during the Middle Ages? Lesson 2.5 explains how both events, war and plague, led to the end of feudalism. Shattered buildings and churches, deserted villages, and abandoned fields. This formed the landscape of Europe after war and disease swept throughout the continent in 1300s. Both catastrophes brought suffering and deaths to millions. Like the Crusades, greatly weakened the feudal way of life. Feudal system is a system of inequality, and because of so many warfares and the disease, it killed a lot of people. If you will look at it in a shorter vision perspective, it seems that it's all negative. But in the long run, it created an equal opportunity for a lot of people. Today, we'll talk about two things: the 100 Years' War between France and England, and the bubonic plague that swept across Europe, killing about a third of its population. The 100 Years' War was first not a continuous conflict, but rather a series of wars that dragged for about 116 years. So it's more than 100. There are so many things to unpack with this 100 Years' War, and the simple animation provides greater, simpler, straightforward information how it started and what are the key moments in history that are important to at least remember or understand.
The 100 Years' War, the pageants and tournaments of chivalry, knights in burnished armour, the English archer destroying the flower of French chivalry, the great battles of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, or just a sign of the brutality of the Middle Ages, senseless warfare and destruction, the death of thousands in the mud of France for nothing more than the greed and ambition of kings. There's all of this and more in the 100 Years' War. It's a story of courage, the clash of nations, a story of human endeavour and the timeless struggle for supremacy. Yet there's also another story here, the story of a war that helped define England, her sense of herself, her language, her role in the world. The 100 Years' War helped form a nation. Welcome to the Extra History of England. It's 1328. The new King of England is a young man called Edward III. But he's powerless, because his mother's lover, a man named Roger Mortimer, had seized control of his throne. But Edward was a warrior and a leader of men. In 1330, at the age of only 17, he gathered some friends and by pale moonlight snuck into Mortimer's castle. He cut down the guards and seized Mortimer himself. The interloper was dragged through the jeering crowds of London, dragged to the gallows known as the Tyburn Tree, where countless traitors would die over the centuries and hung by the neck until dead. From that point, Edward was determined that England and his royal court would be a shining example of culture to all Christendom. The court of the young king was a pageant of colour, music, tournaments and poetry. He surrounded himself with the enormously wealthy nobility and modelled his court on the glory of the ancient and mythical Camelot, of King Arthur, a celebration of the cult of chivalry. But part of that cult was that the king would lead his nobles to war, wealth and glory. And while at times the nobility did strain against the king's authority, for the most part they were his natural allies, holding their lands from him and working with him to govern his kingdom and his people. And so, with his greatest nobles at his side, Edward did what he loved most and was born for. He led his nobility to war and crushed the Scots in battle. But then in 1337, Edward's world was threatened. The French were at the gates. Well, not the literal gates. Actually, it's a complex dynastic claim involving several hundred years of medieval inheritance law and international politics. We should be able to cover that in just a few sentences. For centuries, the French and English royal dynasties had fought over land in France. In the blue corner, the French royal dynasty, the Valois, and in the red corner, the English royal dynasty, the Plantagenets. And the Valois king of France, King Philip VI of France, was determined to take the last of Edward's French lands away from him. Because medieval kingdoms didn't follow modern borders or rules. They were the property of a king and his nobles. English claims in France went all the way back to 1066, when a French noble called William the Bastard decided that he deserved more than the lands he held in Normandy. He made the most of a distant claim to the English throne, sailed across the Channel, beat up the English and became known to history as William the Conqueror. The old Anglo-Saxon landowners were swept away, and England became the property of French-speaking lords. French was the language of the nobility, of literature, of the king's court. English was the language of the peasant and the serf. Fast forward 100 years, and in 1155, a young man called Henry became King Henry II of England. Henry came from Anjou in France, and so more French land was added to those holdings in Normandy that came from old Billy the Conk. Plus, Henry then married the richest heiress in Europe, always a good way of paying the bills, the powerful, cultured and intelligent Eleanor of Aquitaine. And she brought even more French land to the English crown. Henry and his successors, the Plantagenet royal family, now owned almost half of modern France. They spoke French, they loved France, they were French. If they had to choose between a croissant and a full English breakfast, it'd be the croissant every time. But there's a catch. Most of these lands were in theory still owned by the kings of France. Like all medieval vassals, everyone with lands in France was supposed to kneel and pay homage to the Valois kings for them. In practice, though, the likes of Billy the Conk and Henry II were simply too powerful to be forced to do what the Valois told them to do. So they just paid lip service to the French king's theoretical rights and got on with the party. But over the centuries, bit by bit, the Valois had used their rights to take back most of that land while weaker Plantagenets were on the English throne. By the time Edward III was born, most of those lands had been successfully reclaimed by the French, leaving only a single province left in English hands, a place called Gascony. The Valois king, Philip VI, was determined to take that last province away from the Plantagenets and England. Philip had no doubt he could achieve this. After all, France was the most powerful and glorious country in all Christendom. It was one of the leading centres of culture and learning. Philip only counted as his equals the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and that's it. England was just a small, damp and slightly grubby country somewhere in the North Sea. The French nobility were the shining exemplar of chivalry, while the English nobility were not. Philip made trouble for Edward. He made an alliance with the Scots against the English, and then at his court in 1337 he formally confiscated Gascony. Edward tried to talk. Philip told him to talk to the hand. Edward told him to talk to the edge of his sword. He would defend his rights. The confiscation was not just an insult to Edward. It was also a threat to English merchants. England had two great sources of wealth. One was in the wine trade with Gascony. The Gascon merchants as well as the English hated the idea of losing the wine trade with England. Even more important, though, was the wool trade, with the county of Flanders in the modern-day Belgium. The textile industry was far and away the biggest industry in medieval Europe other than agriculture. No other industry was a fraction of its value, and the textile industry was dominated by the densely populated towns of northern Italy and Flanders. English wool fed that trade. English wool was the best in all Europe, finer, with longer strands making it easier to turn into yarn and creating the softest, strongest woolen cloth. Every year, thousands of huge wool sacks were sold to Flemish merchants, and every year customs dues from the trade filled the English treasury. But the Count of Flanders was a subject of the French king, and now King Philip told Flanders they could no longer trade with the English. The Flemish were as horrified as the English. Without English wool, their industry would die and their people would starve. So one Friday, in the bustling market square in Ghent in Flanders, the people gathered excitedly round a wooden stage. It was covered with colourful pennants and flags. But they saw a new flag, the arms of England quartered with the royal arms of France, and they wondered what that could mean. A young, powerful man stepped forward. His name, he declared, was King Edward III. He had been wrongfully banned from his lands in France, and he would reclaim his right. The people cheered. But there was more. by the right of his French mother, he was claiming the very throne of France itself. The Flemish cheered, the French giggled. War was now unstoppable. At stake on the English side was trade, the English role in Christendom, the king's lands in France held by right for 150 years, and the reputation and honour of the king. On the French side, a unified country, national prestige, and the right of their monarch to his throne. So join us next time as these two great kings marshal their forces and the 100 Years' War begins in earnest.
Long story short, William, Duke of Normandy, which is part of France, conquered England in 1066 and became its king. And a lot of the kings who followed after him became vassals to the French kings. However, they also ruled over England in their own right. This created tense relationship between England and France. So kings from both countries were very powerful and competed for territory in France. In time, they also competed over who would be king of France. 1328, the king of France died, and Edward, the king of England, Edward III, believed that he should succeed him. But French nobles crowned a Frenchman instead. So in 1337, Edward decided to invade France to claim his throne. His actions began the 100 Years' War between France and England. Like what I said, this is not a continuous war, but rather a series of wars that dragged for 116 years. So many victories were won by the English crown. The French cause seemed hopeless until rescue came from an unexpected source. A French peasant girl called Joan of Arc claimed that Christian saints had told her to save her country. For some reason, she impressed Charles, the ruler of France, and was given command of his army in 1429. Her religious and patriotic passion inspired her soldiers to win battle that turned the tide of war. The English captured and executed John eventually, but they had lost the war. By 1453, the French had driven the English out of their lands. Side note, both sides use new weapons like longbow, which allowed archers to fire arrows with enough force to pierce a knight's armor. Of course, they used cannons to destroy castle walls and so many other weapons. So these weapons changed the nature of European warfare and made knights and castles and the symbols of feudalism almost powerless. Now, besides war, the other factor that changed Europe during this time is the disease called the bubonic plague. Poor diet, filthy living conditions, and a lack of medicine made sickness very common. So like COVID-19, this plague was brought by animals. Infected rats carried the fleas that spread the disease to humans along land and sea trade routes from Asia to Europe and Africa. Unfortunately, no one at the time understood that the plague was caused by bites from these fleas. Many people believe that the plague was a punishment from God. Some Christians believe that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning town wells. As a result, they destroyed entire Jewish communities, and by early 1350s, the worst of the plague was over in Europe. But by then, it had killed about 1/3 of the continent's population. The deaths of so many people from disease to war led to major social and economic changes that would finally bring an end to feudalism. So for better or for worse, war and disease changed Europe and the rest of the world. Now let's go to the review and assess questions. Number 1, reading check. What impact did the 100 Years' War and bubonic plague have on medieval Europe? Number 2, analyze cause and effect. How did events in 1066 led to the 100 Years' War? And finally, make inferences. How did the rats that carried plague-infected fleas probably travel along the trade routes? Now go to our Google Classroom and open the review and assess assignment and answer this review and assess questions. Go to Google Classroom and open the review and assess assignment for Section 2 and answer the review and assess questions in Lesson 5. Fill up the basic information, last name, first name, class period, date, the key vocabs, the title of the lesson, and obviously the answers to the review and assess questions. If you want to get full credit, besides of course giving the right answer, you need to write incomplete sentences as much as you can. Well, at least 3 to 5 sentences will give you a full credit provided that your answers are correct.